outgrowing this space. Does that make you happy? It makes me happy. Awesome. I'll tell you why it makes me happy. Because having all of you wonderful people here, we are at that time of year where people are auditioning and getting accepted into the program, and we start allocating all the wonderful scholarships that you all help provide next week. And so we really appreciate you, and we really appreciate the fact that this place is getting full. So give yourself a round of applause. 6 years running, we are up about $6,000 more than we brought in last year for scholarships. So thank you so much. We're so excited. There's so much to tell you about and so much to talk about, and I'm going to get you out of here. I'm going to get you out of here in a decent hour. I promise. But I promise not to let you out of here in a decent hour until I've told you what next year's season is. But it's the very last thing I'm going to do, so you have to pay attention. Before we go on any further, we have to say thank you to our wonderful donors who are the supporters of the Bravo Behind the Scenes series, not a one of whom are here. So I'm going to make fun of each of them. First of all, our wine donors, of course, are Danielle Dyer over at Bart's Play and Stay. Will you please give them our donors for the entire series are Bob and Louise Salmons, and Bob texted me yesterday because, of course, your talk is tomorrow night because Louise and I are flying to Boston tomorrow. They're spending a week at Harvard Yard, so they're doing some educating or getting educated, so that's where they are. But will you please thank Bob and Louise Salmons? And very special for tonight's show because you're going to enjoy Doug Morrow on the piano conducting our 11-piece orchestra, and that is thank you to Chuck and Robbie Bro. We've got a lot coming up in the rest of this season, and let me tell you, someone said the other day, we're only 6 weeks in. Can you believe we're 6 weeks in? It feels like we've been here months since the semester began. It's just been such an exciting and busy semester. Coming up in the beginning of April, our next Bravo talk will be April 7th for the show Mr. Burns, a post-electric play. And that, of course, is going to be taking place in the experimental theater season, or in the experimental theater, rather. And so you won't want to miss that. It's a really interesting show. And if you like shows that kind of break down how theater came to be in a light way, or if you just really enjoy The Simpsons, you're going to enjoy Mr. Burns. Don't miss that. And I know Janine, who's directing that show, and unfortunately is sick out tonight, and Jill, who's costuming the show, have a special presentation to give y'all on the night of Mr. Burns. 2 weeks after that, on the 21st of April, we'll be back in here to celebrate the spring dance concert. We've already had our guest artist in town, and so Meredith and Amanda will be giving the talk that night, and they'll be talking about the guest artist who's just done some amazing work this 3 weeks ago? 3 weeks now? 2 weeks? How long? Who are we? Where are we? So you don't want to miss that Bravo talk as well. And then lastly, so that'll be our last Bravo of the series. We're closing our cabaret series this year with so we did the American Songbook the first half of the semester. We're ending it on Cinco de Mayo with a very special cabaret party, if you will. Down at Charlie Dwellington's. This is Liz Sinclair, she's one of our Bravo members, and we're actually going to be down at Charlie's at 1st and Main, and the show is called Guilty Pop Pleasures. And what that means is, the way that is ultimately going to break down is at some point you're going to hear me sing Lady Gaga. That's really all you need to know. We joke about it amongst ourselves that it's karaoke if your friends could sing. So you don't want to miss that. That's actually going to start at 6:30 with a very special cocktail hour with hors d'oeuvres, thanks to Liz Sinclair. And then the show will begin at 7:30. It is one night only, and all of that money goes to music theater scholarships. So thank you, Liz, so much. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to that concert. We have been so busy, so busy. Yesterday was audition day, and for those of you who don't know, most of our auditioning of recruits in this department for all 5 of the degrees really happens from us getting out of Grand Junction and traveling around. We've always had audition days here on campus. Usually, we get 2 or 3, 4, at the very most 5. Yesterday we had the largest audition day we've had in 11 years I've been here. We had 9 people auditioning. They drove up from Arizona. They drove over from the Front Range. We're so excited, and we got some really wonderful recruits, both in the dance program and the music theater program. And so we're just really excited about what's to come. And they're going to be so great next year's shows, and I just can't wait to tell you, but you're going to have to wait. So tonight, I want to talk about Thoroughly Modern Millie. I think that I love this show. I really love this show. And so I'm really excited to talk about it, but I gotta warn you, most of the time I have a grand theme, and I wrap it all together, and I bring it all around. And I just don't have that tonight. I just have a whole lot of anecdotes I want to tell you about it. And so that's what I'm going to do, and hope that in the end it's just as enriching. So we're going to go back just a little bit. In the very beginning of the show, Millie stands out and she says, "This is 1922." So that's the year that this show is taking place. And of course, we know that 1922 is the beginning of the Jazz Age, as Fitzgerald would define it years after. But we know that theater was really vibrant in New York from about the 1860s, 1870s, well before we get to the Roaring '20s and the Jazz Age, and when we'll see musical comedy beginning to emerge. In fact, it was such a popular place for especially British productions or productions that would come over from Europe, and particularly with Gilbert and Sullivan, right? We think of operetta and Gilbert and Sullivan coming around. Now, typically we think, okay, Gilbert and Sullivan, D'Oyly Carte, those two, the Savoy, and never anything else happened. They just played there, and that's not quite true. When they wrote HMS Pinafore in 1877, it was doing so well in London that all the Americans were like, "We love HMS Pinafore, so why don't we just do productions of HMS Pinafore?" And they estimate that the year following HMS Pinafore's opening in London, that there were around 150 illegal productions of HMS Pinafore. And of course now we think of Pinafore and it's like in the public domain. We can do it for free whenever we want, But at that time, it just got written. And there are at least 150 illegal productions going on. So D'Oyly Carte and Gilbert and Sullivan are like, well, we need to optimize on this money. So let's put together our own special production of Pinafore, and we'll take it over to New York. Awesome, wonderful. We're going to do that first in 1879. Now, I should also mention that at this point, they're already steadily working on the Pirates of Penzance. Okay? In fact, so much so that Gilbert makes it a point to make sure he packs all of Act 2, which he has already completed because he writes in reverse, and then all the sketches for Act 1. He's going to finish Act 1 of Pirates of Penzance in New York City. They show up December 1st, 1879. They open HMS Pinafore. First week is just stellar. Everybody shows up. Everybody loves the show. Second week, not so much. Third week, even worse. Because Americans had already seen that opera time and time and time again, and nobody cared. So Gilbert and Sullivan panic, realize that Gilbert forgot the Act 1 sketches for Pirates of Penzance, and so he goes about trying to recreate it from memory. Finishes the Pirates of Penzance, and it opens on December 31st, New Year's Eve, in New York City. The original premiere of the Pirates of Penzance was in New York City, just to reaffirm how much operetta meant to the culture at the time. We get into the 20th century, and of course, by now we've got immigrants who have moved to the US, particularly Victor Herbert, who I'm going to talk about tonight, from Austria, magnificent cellist. He's hired for the Metropolitan Opera, and his wife is a soprano. That's very nice for the Metropolitan Opera, so they hire both of them. And Victor decides that he's going to start writing these American type of operettas. And of course, from that collection, we get things like Naughty Marietta, and Babes in Toyland, yes? And so particularly of interest for us is Naughty Marietta, which is going to open in 1910. Around that same time, of course, operetta is going on, and that's for the more upper crust of New York. And over on the other side of town is where all the vaudeville theaters are, right? The song and dance people, the beginning of the American Songbook, all those wonderful, fast-witted comedians, all the, dog and pony shows, everything going on, everything you can possibly fit into an evening of performance. And we see these two dichotomies taking place in New York City. We've got this upper crust operetta, and we've got this more down-to-earth, blue-collar vaudeville variety show. By the time we get to the Roaring '20s, we've also got this infusion of jazz. And we begin to see a very different state of musical theater beginning. Because over here we've got operetta that has very specific forms that it takes. And over here we have musical comedy, and it has its own way of looking at things. And I want to talk for just a minute about what the difference between those two things around the beginning of the '20s are. First off, in almost all operettas, not just European operettas, but American operettas as well, Victor Herbert, Sigmund Romberg, Rudolf Frimmel, who were all Americans writing these operettas, they all matched up to what the Europeans were doing. And so when they wrote characters, they would write them very specifically. They were always aristocrats, or wealthy, or the men were if they weren't one of those two things, then they were a soldier of some kind. The ladies were always young, naive, virginal, beautiful, wealthy people. Unless they were exotic. Unless they came from somewhere other than England. And then they were usually not just caricaturized, but they were also either the seductress or they were the villainess. This is all going to come in handy tonight, by the way, in the show. Over on musical comedy, though, no, that's not what's going on. Musical comedy is about 1920s. It's about young people. First of all those people over there in those operettas, they are much older than the characters we are going to see in musical comedy. Musical comedy is going to be about youth. And why not? America is young at this point, and it's just now starting to realize that we can get the keys to the car and go out and have a good time. So why shouldn't our shows reflect youth? And so they do. Suddenly we see a change in mannerisms where operetta characters walk around like this. The musical comedy characters walk around with their hands in their pockets and have a casual energy to them. Familiarity with one another changes. In operetta, we stand about this far from each other. Yes? Primarily because the lady is probably wearing a dress bigger than both of you. But also, the reason we put everybody in those dresses, right, is to make sure we knew there was a circle of safety. Right? Musical comedy, we are no longer worried about the safety of the dress. Instead, we're going to bring the dress in, we're going to bring the skirt up, we're going to put frill on it. Yes, and it may actually show the shoulders. People are going to dance much more freely when they're out of those corsets that the operetta requires. And they're going to dance to the music of the jazz age. They're going to dance to the music of the big band and all this wonderful music that's beginning to come out of Tin Pan Alley. Much different from operetta, where we're still in a very much a classical European operatic funk. F-A-C-H. I didn't say that as well. It means vocal type. Of course it does. I say it all the time, though, because it's wonderful. The locations are different. Operetta, it is very much about castles and manor houses and always out in the country. Musical comedy is about one place and one place only, New York City. Nearly every musical comedy that you'll find is set right smack dab in the middle of New York City. And why shouldn't it? New York City is the heart of all this youthful energy that America is feeling at this time, right? Or at least that's what they branded themselves as. And that hasn't really changed, right? The last thing that we see really different there is that we begin to hear music that is not necessarily only there to tell a story. Operetta is very much about composers trying to create the feeling of the story that they're trying to set and the place of the story they're trying to set. All the musical comedy pieces over here, though, are all set in New York, and so it just needs to sound like New York, and that could mean a whole lot of different things. So over here, where the script is well placed to set us up for following the character and becoming invested in the character, over here in musical comedy, it's really about, look, I don't really care what the script is about. I don't care how stupid the plot may be. I really just want Irving Berlin to write the songs, and I want a lot of dancing girls. There you go. And that's how they wrote the musicals. Loosely put together by a script. But really only about dancing, song, and one other thing. Comedy sketches. There's got to be that fast-witted comedy that we see in vaudeville. So we see these various, these opposite sides of this musical theater realm. And the reason that I bring that up to you is because by 1922, we are smack dab in the middle of those two time periods. We see the beginning of musical comedy as about 1914. We see the end of vaudeville as about 1928. We see the end of the operetta period about the same time. About the time, the market crashes, there's no one to pay for it. So this show manages to sit in between these two worlds. And there are characters that reflect the older operetta mentality. There are characters who reflect wealth or reflect a certain amount of aristocracy. One other thing I should point out about operetta, almost always the characters are going in disguise. Usually they are wealthy people who are trying to be poor peasants, so everybody will, I want to go live my life. That's going to come into play tonight. By the end of the show, you're going to be like, Jeremy, yes, I get it. Not until then. But you also have these characters that reflect, oh, by the way, operetta is also about romance. And then we have these characters that seem to reflect this romance that we see in operetta. Over here, we have this very modern mentality for the musical comedy. And of course, in this particular show, it begins with the idea that in the 1920s, we begin to see women entering the workforce. And that becomes a major part of the plot of Thoroughly Modern Millie. So you're going to have characters, Trevor Graydon, Dorothy, who are going to reflect this operetta, and you're going to see Millie and Jimmy and other characters that reflect this musical comedy era. So where did this show come from? A lot of people say, oh, that feels like an old show. It does. It feels like an old show, especially in a lot of the plot line and the way the plot is told. It was actually written in 2000. It opened on Broadway in 2002. It's based on, however, a film that was written in 1967. 1967, Thoroughly Modern Millie, starring Julia Andrews as Millie, starring Carol Channing and Mary Tyler Moore, with songs written for the show by Sammy Cahn and Jimmy Van Heusen, who are best known for Come Fly With Me, Come Fly, Let's Fly Away, or Love and Marriage, Love and Marriage, come together like a horse and carriage. Anyway, y'all were so reticent. It has a score, the original film has a score by Elmer Bernstein. The great cinema film writer, or score writer. But it was arranged by Andre Previn. So this movie is just stock full of people at the height of their careers. So fast forward to 2001. Now, one other thing I want to point out as we get to 2001 is that musical comedy has a way of coming back to us. Musical comedy goes away in about 1942 and then kind of jumps back in. As soon as we enter the golden age and everything becomes, we cannot have some stupid script holding everything together. It's got to be a script that is deeply ingrained in the character and the storytelling, and the dance has to reflect the story, and the music has to reflect the story, and the comedy has to reflect the story. And we see that change in 1942, but over the next 80 years, we see musical comedy make these resurgences. And there's a pattern to it. Almost always, with few exceptions, it comes back during time of war or disaster. If you think back, I said that the beginning of the musical comedy era we usually think of as 1914, which is an important date, yes? Yeah. Beginning of World War I. You'll notice that I said that the golden age begins in 1942. The beginning of America's involvement in World War II. By the way, there's an interesting story about Oklahoma opening in 1942, because on one side of the stage you had Oklahoma, which was changing the entire genre forever, and on the other side of the street, Richard Rodgers could literally walk down the middle of Times Square, and on one side it was Oklahoma, and on the other side was his and Larry Hart's musical Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is straight up musical comedy. And of course it was, because we were just entering war. We see this happen again with the Korean War, we see it happen again with the Vietnam War, and we see it happen at 2001, September 11th. When the World Trade Center is bombed, or attacked, there are all these shows that have either just opened, because September's a busy month on Broadway. We had seen all these shows that had just opened, or were just about to open. And by the way, I'm not trying to belittle 9/11 as, it forced these shows to close. Please don't think I'm more about cause and effect here. But when 9/11 happened, suddenly we were put back into that disaster state, where what we really crave is laughter, things that bring us together rather than theater that makes us challenged or possibly fight. And musical comedy is one of those ways that it frequently comes back. And so, at the time, 9/11, when that happened, there was already a piece of new musical comedy that was playing. Mel Brooks' The Producers, which of course is a modern version of a musical comedy piece. But there were also all these wonderful shows that didn't make it through that month or two. And realizing I could go on a whole lecture about how New York helped keep Broadway shows open in hopes of building the economy and bringing people back to tourism after 9/11. I won't go into that too much, but I will say that there was a lot of subsidy that went into the city of New York actually buying tickets, about $2.5 million worth of tickets, to help keep Broadway shows open. Broadway shows that almost closed at that time were Phantom of the Opera, which is still open, by the way, Les Mis, these big shows that have been running for quite some time. But also we see these really wonderful smaller off-Broadway shows begin to die away. Things like this wonderful piece called Reefer Madness, which is based on the exploitation film Reefer Madness. All these wonderful things that just kind of got lost. But what we get out of it is this new version of musical comedy that manages to take us from the golden age and everything we know about following good character and writing characters that an audience loves and can see through the song and the dance, all of these things come together, but to still enjoy the lightness and the comedy and the joy of musical comedy. And that, for me, is what Thoroughly Modern Millie is it reminds us of all those things. And I say that all about operetta because you're going to actually hear operetta tonight. The best thing I can tell you about Thoroughly Modern Millie for me is that those of you who were here when I talked about Once Upon a Mattress, I said that it was the first time in my 20-year career that I had ever music directed a show that was composed by a female composer. This is the second time. And a wonderful composer by the name of Janine Tesori. This was her first show. Since then, she has won the Tony for pieces like Fun Home. She's written, if you've seen Shrek the Musical, Shrek, she wrote the score for Shrek. Beautiful pieces like Caroline or Change. She's just one of our greatest composers, I think, living today. And she manages to take all these Con Van Heusen songs from the actual movie Thoroughly Modern Millie, and then she takes this operetta, because there are pieces directly stolen from Gilbert and Sullivan and Victor Herbert. Why shouldn't we? It's in the public domain. So you're going to hear pieces from Ruddigore, which was a later piece by Gilbert and Sullivan that actually premiered in the US, the famous Matter Patter Trio. You'll recognize it as the speed test when we get to it in Act 1. Which is just basically that entire piece lifted out and new lyrics written to it. You're going to hear pieces like, "Ah, sweet mystery of life, at last I found thee." Yes, Victor Herbert from Ronnie Marietta. Also, "For I'm falling in love with someone." Yes, these wonderful opera pieces. But you're going to hear those. You're going to hear these wonderful Van Heusen Con songs. But then you're going to also see this score that manages to take all of these pieces and then add these beautiful songs to it and make it all feel like one complete whole work as if it's brand new and you've never heard it before. You're going to hear this beautiful stuff that is reminiscent of what we think of as New York, those things like Gershwin and Rhapsody in Blue. You're going to hear a lot of that in a beautiful ballad in the second act called I Turned a Corner. Notice it. And so that's really what the things that I hope you pay attention to as far as like the inner workings of the show. We've had a rough week. I'm just going to be honest with you. If you didn't know, college campuses are cesspools. But literally, we come to work with armor on. Because once one of them gets sick, it just moves through. And for the last 5 days, we've been dealing with flu. We've dealt with at least 6 cases of strep. We've had a lead with laryngitis. We've had another lead with tonsillitis. But I'm here to tell you that we have had 2 of the most exciting performances of Shirley Modern Millie. We have. And I don't say that just because all the craziness has happened, because we have some really great students who just really have stepped up for the show. I'm going to try not to cry. But what I'm going to tell you is that the thing I really want you to watch tonight is that the reason this show is working, even though so many people are sick and holding it together, is because the 2 people who put it together. And that is Ben Rigel, who's the director, and Amanda Benson, who's the choreographer. They have a couple things they'd like to say about the show, but let me just say that we don't always get it right, but when we do, it's awesome. And these are 2 of the most exciting hires we've had in forever, and it's been such a pleasure working with them. And when you see tonight's show, you're going to know why I say that. Please welcome Ben.
You made me blush. I'm blushing now.
Now they're all going to cry.
I know. Thank you, Jeremy. And what he pointed, I mean, it really, my director's notes, I say this again, but yeah, theater's collaborative, but this was the most collaborative process I've been in. You know, I direct a fair amount, but I don't direct a lot of musicals. In fact, I have a lot of friends from before I moved here, like, you're directing a musical? I was like, yes, I'm directing a musical. I don't bring anything like the kind of knowledge to musicals that Jeremy has. And it was really helpful to have somebody who knows how musicals work a lot more than I do. And this show is really such a collaboration between, I mean, I keep joking that it really, I shouldn't get billing as the director, it's a triumvirate, you know, it's sort of the 3 of us really, you know, Jeremy with the music and Amanda with the choreography and me with the little bits in between. It's really been kind of a pleasure to work on. It's something I stressed about a lot from the time I got hired over the summer, and I was told I was going to do, well, asked if I wanted to do Thoroughly Modern Millie, but it was like, there's not another choice. It's like, that's the show you're directing. You know, I'm very nervous about that because I know that musicals, it's a little different than when you're directing all on your own. Because if you don't get along with people you're working with, or if you don't have a vision that fits together, you're in trouble. And this one was a joy to work on. It has been a rough week though. And I'll tell you, I did not prepare my remarks like Jeremy did, so I'm gonna jump all over the place. This week has been a crazy week, and but you're gonna see some understudies in tonight. They were in last night, and I was blubbering in the audience because it was. There's nothing like watching an understudy go on and kill it, and that's what happened last night. And if we hadn't told the audience it was an understudy, no one would have known. It was a fantastic show, and it's going to be again tonight. So it was great. I want to let Amanda talk here in a minute. I was going to talk just for a second about sort of the process that got us here. I did not know all of this stuff about Millie until working on the show. I'm not steeped in musical theater knowledge the way that I am in some other kinds of in classical theater, for example, which is what I'm usually doing. And so the baggage I brought to Millie was sketchy because I'd seen it only once. And it wasn't good. And And I knew it wasn't the musical's fault, it was the production, but it wasn't good. And so a lot of my choices, especially early on, and this is dangerous as a director, when you're making anti-choices. A lot of my choices in the pre-production, everything was all about, I don't want it to be like that other production I saw. And that certainly influenced my casting of the show, which I'm very happy with, but I in some cases, I steered so far away from people that didn't work in another production. And then the same thing goes with the design process. With the production that I had seen, they went very realistic with the design, which I thought was a huge mistake for a show like this. This show does feel like it was written in the 20s or 30s, but it at least at first glance. But then when you really look at it, it's a fantasy version of the 1920s. The way that the Three Musketeers is a fantasy version of the 1620s, because Alexandre Dumas wrote that in the 1850s. It's not written by somebody who was there, and Millie has that feel to it too. It's a fantasy version of the 20s, and so that was sort of the way I went into it with talking to the designers. We had a designers. The set designer is David Cox, who you all know, but he kind of came in at the last. He came in late because the person who was on faculty ended up leaving us. And so David came in, but he grasped what I was going for very quickly. He's a beautiful painter, as probably all of you know, so it's a beautifully painted set with this very Art Deco look to it. And this great backdrop that reminds me, it's a couple of decades off, but it reminds me of, if you remember those 1940s Superman cartoons? Those really cool Superman cartoons from the 40s. And that's what the backdrop looks like. And it's got this great exaggerated, non-realistic look to it, which I think is necessary for a show like this. If you put them in a realistic setting, their behavior doesn't make any sense because it's just not the way they behave. And Jill, who costumed the hell out of the show, she got on board right away with sort of the idea of the stylization of the show, and it's beautifully done. It's been a real joy to work on. And although this week has aged me a lot. But it all was a happy ending, and the last couple of weeks have really been rewarding. And then working with Amanda, who I've never worked with, and not knowing anything about Amanda other than she's a really good tapper. That's sort of what I knew going into this was, okay, she's a really good tapper. Good. Turns out she's also really good at telling a story in the dance, which was something that I was. I'm married to a dancer. I'm married to a dance choreographer, and so I'm learning about it. We've been married for 6 years. I'm sort of learning, like, okay, I didn't know much about dance before that, and dance covers a lot of ground, and it can be very abstract. But with a musical theater, it has to tell a story, and not sure how it was going to work, and it really, it's lovely because she makes the blocking of the show look really good. So I get to bask in sort of the reflected artistry of both Jeremy with the musical direction of the show, and they sound great, and with Amanda, the way she's choreographed them, and then the way Jill's made them look, and the set they're on. Why am I telling them this? I shouldn't. So, it really made my job quite easy, so I'm going to let Amanda talk now.
Joy. There's a lot of dance in this show. The students learned a lot of dance, and I am extremely impressed with how far they came in 5 very short weeks. The amount as...
Has it only been 5 weeks?
Yeah, it's only been 5 weeks, everyone.
This week has been 5 weeks. 10 years.
We've aged a few years in 5 weeks, and especially this week. But yeah, as Ben said, I am a phenomenal tap dancer. I do credit that to my parents who are here today. My parents had the wherewithal to see a need in me at the age of 3, and they put me in the tap classes then. So here I am now. I think what has been such a joy in choreographing this particular musical is that it is set in the 1920s, and as Jeremy said, it is the jazz age, which means jazz dance and tap dance. We're flourishing and expanding and spreading, and that's a really exciting time for me as the jazz and tap Shim Sham. You'll see a little bit of Shim Sham Shimmy in there. So it was a really exciting time for me to share that history and that wealth of knowledge with the students and to see them make connections of today, even in the hip hop genre of like, whoa, well this is called something else now. Whip and Nay Nay. It's called the rock now. And I was like, that's actually a break a leg. So making all those connections has been a really wonderful experience for me, and I hope you enjoy the show.
But the only reason you're actually here is to hear next year's season. So I'll do musicals, you'll do plays, you'll do dance concerts.
Do we want to talk about the?
Yeah.
I think we should share.
Yeah.
Well, we're doing something just a little different next year. Is we decided to sort of name the season, to give the season sort of a unifying, unifying theme that would sort of that would somehow speak to all the shows that we're going to do. And so next year is Ends and Means: The Pursuit of Happiness. That's sort of the overarching theme of the season, and all the shows in one way or another are a reflection of ends and means: The Pursuit of Happiness. So we'll be starting.
We're going to start with an exciting new production, an all-female production of 1776.
Good reaction. We're going to follow that up with Bruce Norris's Pulitzer Prize winning and Tony Award winning Clybourne Park. And if you don't know that one, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 2010 and 11, I think it's 2 years, and then it won the Tony Award for Best Play. And it is the companion piece to Raisin in the Sun. So if you remember Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun, about the black family that's going to move into the white neighborhood, this is the first act of Clybourne Park. If you remember the only white character in Raisin in the Sun, it's Carl, who shows up to try to talk the family out of moving to his neighborhood. The act 1 of Clybourne Park is him returning back from that trip to the house that's being sold to the black family, trying to talk them out of selling it. And then we cut to 50 years later in the same house, and now the neighborhood's being gentrified. So it's a really fascinating play with a lot of things to say, a really challenging play, and so that'll be number 2 in the season. Then
The dance concert, which all the pieces within the dance concert will be themed around ends.
Then we're going to come back from the winter break, and we're going to do this amazing rock opera that you've never heard of called Reefer Madness.
see what he did there when he laid that in earlier? Can I say the next one? I think this is an official capacity.
Yeah, it's official capacity.
Then we're going to follow with Macbeth. In the Black Box Theater.
And then the spring dance concert. Can you guess what it's going to be? Yeah!
So that's our season next year. We are really excited about it. We hope that you'll be excited about it too. And now we're going to let you go. Get some wine. Get back in there. There's plenty back there, right? Before we go, I just want to really quickly thank our outreach committee, who are the ones who helped put together the Bravo reception. Meredith Lyons, who's serving wine back there. Nicole Driver, who does all the food for us. Jill Van Russell, who kept everybody in tonight. And then, of course, I want to point out our 2 Bravo scholars. The other 3 Bravo scholars are in the show, but Murphy and Heather, they are on top.